Okay, let's get started. Lights off in 3, 2, 1. Lights off. Well, happy Halloween. Hopefully this is not the scariest thing that you'll see today. Some announcements, problem set 7 as usual is due on Sunday, and then the big changes are the following. And I think I put these announcements on Blackboard, and so you may have seen this by now. There are 2 Tuesdays coming up at the end of November and the first Tuesday in December on which we will not have class. I will send out an email to make sure that you guys get reminded about this beforehand so you don't show up needlessly. As part of a makeup, what we might do is try to convene on Monday, November 18th, and I realize that you may not be able to do that if your schedules do not permit it, and if they don't, then you can't come. But the reason I think that might be very interesting is that tentatively the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that's the FRBNY acronym here, is going to come and speak at Queens College. That's what I have heard through the grapevine, although it's not been announced yet. So if that happens, I'm going to request that you attend that, and if you can't attend it, then you can't attend it, and that's not a big deal. Perhaps it can be recorded or something like that. It's a pretty cool thing, and I don't know who has pulled the strings to get that to happen. I hope it does happen. It's not been, like I said, not been formally announced. Any questions about this or any other course logistics? Okay, moving on. We're talking about the economy in the short run. So we started off with stuff that was about long-run trends in well-being. It's also a story about differences right now between different countries at different levels of development, about the quality of well-being and the quality of life here in the United States, let's say, versus the well-being in developing countries. And, well, just as a side note, I was reading an op-ed in the New York Times by an Italian newspaper reporter who was talking about how bad things are and have been in Italy now. And it turns out that over the period 2001 to 2011, Italy's annual growth is equivalent to that of, he compared it to Zimbabwe and Haiti, two struggling developing countries. It turns out that Japan also has grown at about the same pace, and we're talking about 0.2% annual growth during those years, which is pretty darn low. Now, the fact is that the United States also was not growing very rapidly over that decade. It's 2001 to 2011. Our rate of growth annualized was about 1.4 or so, 1.5 perhaps, depending on which measure you take. But still, one would wonder, what is the deal with Italy? And what is the deal with Japan? And why are they having such struggles with growth? And those are very good questions. And they are relevant, I think, relevant questions to ask about in kind of the long-run sense. But there are many interesting short-run dynamics, as you know. And so the good part about this is I think we are getting into the part of the course that will make a lot more intuitive sense to you, because the short run is what we live every day. It's not, the long run is not what we live every day. It's not things that we're really accustomed to. So what we're going to do is change how we look at things a little bit and distinguish between current GDP, which is going to be our primary measure of how well we are doing currently, and potential GDP. And hopefully the nomenclature makes sense to you. If you're living up to your potential, then you're doing well. But you might also not be living up to your potential. And in that case, things aren't great, right? It turns out you could also be exceeding your potential in this class anyway, and that probably is the less commonly heard descriptive of how one is doing. I always feel like, living up to your potential is what you hear from ages about 5 through 15 or so, and then they give up when you're sort of a late teenager. When this gap between current and potential GDP, that's the measure of performance in the short run. When the gap is negative, GDP and employment are lower than what they normally are. But it turns out that there is a silver lining to the cloud, as we will discuss. When that happens, it tends to be the case that inflation is declining. It doesn't mean that inflation itself is low, but it means something about the change in inflation, or the first derivative. What is happening to inflation, and typically it will be falling during periods of rough times, of recession. So it doesn't mean that inflation will be, zero or a negative or anything. It just means that it is on the decline typically when this is happening. So that can be a benefit for consumers and for savers, but it can also be problematic for other reasons that we'll get to. So here's the long view. Again, it's stuff that none of us have ever lived through, really. The biggest wiggle was way back in the late 1920s and 1930s. And so far, we've only talked about the trend here, which, if you squint, is the blue dashed line that is kind of an average of what's happening in the actual economy, which is the blue line. So the blue line is actual. What did I call it in the previous slide? Actual GDP. It's what is actually happening. The green dashed line is the potential GDP, the prediction of what normally could happen. So here's the Great Depression. And the thing about that, none of us lived through it, but we have probably heard references to it over the last 5 years or so. That actually was so traumatic and so severe that it prompted the federal government to actually start measuring the economy in a coherent way. And prior to that, you may not believe this, but it's really true, that prior to that, the government didn't measure what was happening with the GDP and what was happening broadly with unemployment. There are statistics that try to measure those things from that period, but they, I think, were largely, rediscovered through historical studies, looking at library tomes and trying to sort of figure out what was happening then. It was only after the Great Depression that policymakers realized we have got to figure out what is going on right now so that we can design policy appropriately, and so they came up with national income accounting. So it's hard to see the other wiggles, but they're just a whole lot smaller, and of course that really is a very good thing. If you squint, and I realize this is not easy on the eyes, the biggest wiggle probably is this one, the recession that happened right around 1980, and that is a very interesting one, it turns out, for reasons we will explore later. This graph does not actually have the most recent story on it, so here I'm going to next. I really should have extended this back, I guess, all the way back to get the Great Depression as well. This graph now starts in 1950, and it shows what has been happening recently. So again, here, what are the biggest wiggles? Well, the current one, the one we're in, right, all the way to the right-hand side here. I mean, that's really rather remarkable that we've kind of fallen off potential and stayed down. There has been growth. That's this, there's a positive slope here, which means that there has been growth since the trough was reached, but we have not bounced back to potential. And it does look a little bit like what this recession around 1980 looks like as well. There, it looked like we were kind of moving sideways with no growth at all, and then finally a recovery that gradually brought us back up to potential. Another little dip around 1990, I think, is where that is. Yeah, and then this was this great period of expansion, but again, our belief is anyway that we were below potential for a while, finally above it at the waning years of the Clinton administration, and then a recession with September 11th and George Bush taking office, a slight recovery, and then back into the tar pit here of horribleness. Zooming in more, this is what we've seen most recently since 2000, so roughly since the transition from Clinton to Bush. And now on to Obama. I mean, you got to feel for Barack Obama because the guy inherited a broken economy, basically. I mean, he comes into office during this, right, this horrible free fall, it would appear. And, there were a bunch of policies that were passed, tax cuts and spending increases, and not to mention monetary policy to try to get us back on track, but it really hasn't really taken root as fully as maybe we would like it to. The most recent estimate of GDP growth comes from the second quarter of this year, which ended in June. So we are shortly going to see the estimate for quarter 3, which is July, August, September. But why don't we know that yet? Partly it's the regular vicissitudes of how these statistics are collected, but the other thing, of course, is the government shut down. So through part of October, they were not actually assessing what was happening. So I think the current date for quarter 3 would be sometime in November. It usually is at the end of the month, the first month after the quarter ends, which would have been this week, but it didn't happen. So that's where we are, and the question for policymakers, of course, is why are we down here, and can we get back up to potential? The other, of course, real possibility is that potential GDP, well, first of all, it might not be that blue line anymore. That's a guess, really. It's an educated guess about what we could be producing if we had everybody employed and everybody was sort of cooperating in a sense. You could say that. It could also be the case that maybe it is up there, but maybe it will decline. And why might potential GDP decline? Well, what produces potential GDP? It's capital, but it's also labor and the quality and ability of labor to combine with capital, and then it's also total factor productivity. And the thing is, with an extended recession, it could well be the case that workers' skills start to deteriorate, which would not be a good thing at all. So these are very important questions for macroeconomics, getting back on track. And in this course, we'll give you an overview about how to think about this. And it's no solution, it's just a framework for thinking about it. Nobody really knows why this is happening and what we could do to get back on track. But there are plenty of opinions, and so I guess the challenge is just to sort of sort through them and see what makes sense. Questions or comments about this so far? Well, let's talk about where we've been and where we're headed, and I'm going to show you some math that you have not seen yet, so it will be confusing to you. But I wanted to put this up front and show it to you, and we'll see it again and again over the next several weeks. So actual GDP, I guess that's what I'm calling it now, uppercase Y sub t, so it changes over time, of course, is equal to the expenditure side version of the world. So it's C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. Consumption spending, investment spending, typically by businesses, government spending, things like my salary actually is government spending. I'm working here at City University of New York, so it's part of government. Government spending is also, say, buying tanks and missiles and stuff like that. It's also buying roads and federal highway funds that purchase roads and all that. Exports and then subtracting off the imports, because what we're doing is we're counting stuff that we produce here, not the things that are produced abroad. So that's actual GDP, and we're going to say it's equal to the expenditure sums, the consumption, everything that's consumed, purchased to consume, everything that's purchased to invest. So that's a very clean way of thinking about it, because what we're going to say then is that potential GDP is what the growth model would give us. It's the growth model from the first part of the course where you've got productivity, uppercase A, and that can change, and it does over time. You've got capital and you've got labor, and you could, of course, think about labor as being number of people, but also number of people augmented by the amount of education and skills that they have, and that's a useful way of thinking about it too. So chapter 7 and 8 that we just got finished talking about introduces how there also is inflation and unemployment, right? So I mean, those are really big deals. So far we hadn't really talked about them at all, and they are there and important. And now moving ahead with a little bit of a break. So this is the original chapter layout in the first edition, and if you have the second or second and a half edition, it may be a little different. But the chapters 9 through 12 are the short run, and then 15 is let's think about exchange rates working in the short run model. And it introduces this way of thinking about why you might find actual GDP differing from potential, and why it is that spending can exceed or fail to meet potential, basically. Why it is that the demand side, this is a very good way of thinking about it, the demand side is the red box, right? It's the spending. The demanders in the economy are demanding these goods that are produced by the suppliers, the labor and capital and the firms that sort of tell them what to do down here. Demand and supply might not be equal all the time. Demand might fall. It's also possible, and we will have less to say about this, but the other prevailing view out there is that there could be a supply side argument for why there could be a recession, that in fact this might change, and in particular it might change because labor might choose to work more or to work less, and that's certainly true as well. So what we are going to do, and I apologize for how these are unfortunately a little tiny. Let me not even show this to you. This is in the slides. I think it's just going to confuse you, and I'm sorry. So I'm going to make this clear in a second. There are all these elements to the short-run model that you have not seen yet, and we will see them. So let me not even spend time right now because it's hard to see. These are very tiny, and I'm going to show them to you in greater detail in a second. So potential GDP in the long run is what the growth model gives us. And in the first part of the course, we learned how potential GDP is obtained through growth in the factors. And in particular, the back of the envelope is kind of helpful here. Well, how big are these things? Well, we assume population growth is what it is in the United States. It's about 1.5%, maybe closer to 1.2 or 1.3%. But you know, it's positive growth. It continues about I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, we hit the 300 million mark of population in the United States, and it continues to rise. Now, especially if you're a New Yorker, you might think, well, this is really not that great. I would rather have fewer people. They seem to keep bumping into me on the subway, you might say. And if you're concerned about the environment, you might say, well, this is not great because the more people there are, the more cars they drive, and the more gas they guzzle, and the more grass they make brown by running over, or something like that. And I think that's a fair point. Population growth is also seems to be rather correlated with economic growth, as we saw in the first part of the course. And one of the big challenges is, coming back to Italy and Japan, is that in countries where population growth seems to be rather low or even possibly negative, and it turns out it is in Japan, that the size of the Japanese population is actually falling over time. And you might wonder, well, how could that possibly be? And there are basically two reasons, there are three potential reasons maybe. It could be that Japanese people are just leaving the country, so the population is falling. And it could be because they're not having any babies, and so the population is not replacing itself. And it could be because they're dying off with very high mortality rates. And of those three, the best explanation for the Japanese scenario is that the fertility rate is too low, that they're not having babies really. So the average number of births per Japanese woman over her life cycle is about 1.5, and that does not replace herself and the male. So that's basically why Japan's population is falling. In the case of Italy, it is said that it's the immigration side combined with the fertility being too low. So it's not that Italians or Japanese are dying off at particularly rapid rates. They actually have rather long average lengths of life in those countries, longer than ours. But the fertility rates are quite low. People are not choosing to have children to replace the labor force. And that's a challenge when you have systems of pension support, like our Social Security, let's say, in which workers are paying for their parents to retire. So if the parents don't have kids, and if enough of them do this en masse, it presents a real problem. So I guess I view population growth at a reasonably steady level like this as fairly good. Part of our population growth of 1.5%, roughly speaking, is due to immigration, actually. And I also think that's a good source of economic vitality. And I think others may agree with me and others may disagree. There's growth in ideas, perhaps 1.3%. This is just kind of back of the envelope statements about what we have been seeing. And then it turns out capital is growing quite rapidly. And it's because of continued saving. As we will see coming up in the later part of the course, the saving does come from domestic sources, from Americans saving rather than consuming, but it also comes from abroad. It comes from the Chinese, and it also comes from other countries as well. To some extent, that's fine. We'll take it. And it's because importing saving from abroad raises our domestic capital stock, and it makes American workers more productive. The only downside is that whoever has provided the saving then owns the capital, and we would have to buy it back if they for some reason didn't want it anymore, or wanted to get rid of it or something. We would have to buy it back in order to keep it. So the growth of potential output then would be just applying the growth rate rules to this math. So the growth rate of potential GDPs, the sum of the growth rates of ideas, plus 1/3 the growth rate of capital, plus 2/3 the growth rate of labor. And I kind of fudged everything to make it work out rather nicely. That well, you can. What is a third of 35? That's a rather tough exam question. I guess I would probably need a calculator there, but it turns out that it's 3.5%. This can change if there were a change either in the growth of the labor supply or growth in technology, and it could also change if there were a big evolution in the saving rate as well. And we are going to think about when productivity changes, when there might be a big shift in the growth rate of total factor productivity. It has happened in the past around the industrialized world, but in particular in this country. And it may be happening now, and we also think it may have happened in the early part of last decade. What would change technology? Well, innovation, the pace of finding new ideas and what those ideas actually are. One of the beliefs recently was that the internet revolution finally kind of picked up steam and took over a lot of things in the economy, made people more efficient, and accelerated growth in the 2000s. It's debatable, but you can see it in some of the data, and so that's one of the questions. It turns out that the thing that's, I think, less debatable is that there was a big slowdown in total factor productivity growth back in the 1970s. And precisely why is a little bit of a question, but it definitely seems to show up in the data. Well, what we're going to do is tell stories by breaking down GDP into long-run and short-run components. So there's the current output that we observe and measure quarter by quarter. And it looks like a long-run trend and some kind of a short-run fluctuation. So the potential GDP is basically a straight line. It has a little bit of bends in it when you look at the data that I show you in these graphs, but the pictures that we draw are basically everything is a straight line. That's the way of thinking about it. And we're going to think about percentage deviations from trend. So this is very important now. Short-run output is this Y tilde or Y twiddle. It's got the little swoopy thing over the top of it. And we're defining it in this way. It's the percentage deviation in actual GDP from potential. So, this is a growth rate basically, right? It's if YT is the next thing after Y bar T, then Y minus Y bar divided by Y bar is the percentage by which Y is greater than Y bar. It's just like a growth rate. In words, short-run output pulls us a percentage above or below the trend, which is potential GDP. And why, I'll show you in a second, the size of the fluctuations in GDP over time tend to fit this pattern. Okay, well now I'm going to show you something again that will, I think, confuse you, but I'm hoping that by showing it to you now, even though we don't have all the tools developed, you will kind of see where we are headed. So this is the key measure we will now be focusing on. Y tilde, short-run output. It's the percentage deviation from potential. And so, for example, you might say that right now, the United States is about 4% below its potential GDP. So ideally, we would have 4% more output than we currently have. And one way of viewing that is that we have a fair amount of unemployment, and that's kind of the problem. Okay, so here's this graphical view. I hope it's helpful, but I also think it will confuse you, and I will narrate through and hopefully make it clearer. It shows how the short-run model, and that's what we're developing now in the course here until December, basically, fits inside the long-run model that we have developed. Okay, here's a time plot, just like we saw a few slides ago, where GDP is along the vertical axis. And again, just keep in mind that what we're doing is taking logarithms, or equivalently showing it in terms of a ratio scale. So that means that a straight line, say like this, is representing growth at a constant rate. And in particular, growth in GDP, or rather in potential GDP, in the United States is around 3.5% and rather constant. Now, even as I'm saying this, I should also just tell you that we don't really know for sure if potential is really growing at 3.5%. it might be different. My guess would be that if anything, we might find out it's actually lower now because we're in kind of a new uncertain time. But this is a very helpful way of looking at what's really going on in the macroeconomy. And of course, what's really going on looks something less like this blue line and more like this red line, where actual GDP, which we're conceptualizing as the demand side, it's the expenditures of consumption, investment, government, exports, and imports all combined, looks more like this. It goes up and it goes down, right? But it wiggles around the potential line. So it doesn't do any old weird thing. It tends to kind of stay around this blue line. It just isn't often the case that we're exactly at potential. This period here, where we're seeing the red line above the blue line, is where actual GDP, which is the red line, exceeds potential by some percentage. And so that's what Y tilde is. It's a percentage excess in Y over Y bar, and it's positive. So that's what we're going to define as the expansion, or boom, and then followed by this period where the red line is below the blue line, and that's what we're going to call the recession. So Y tilde being negative is a recession. Okay? Questions about this so far? Clear as mud? It'll become clearer, hopefully, as we go on. This now is going to be very confusing. Where we are next headed is a story about why we might be at a particular place in the red line relative to the blue line. Why it is, and so I know this looks really crazy, but we're going to pivot everything and show you a traditional set of axes here, but it actually shows up looking like this. What we're trying to do is explain why it is at this point in time, with the red line up here, why the red line is above the blue line, why it is that we're in an expansion at that point. And here now, these axes are going to be the ones of interest in the second half of the course. Y tilde is going to be the horizontal eventually, but right now notice that it's the GDP is along this axis, and so that's why I'm showing it to you this way. And now there's another axis, and so the real way of doing this would be a 3D plot, but it's very hard to do that, right? So there's a new variable, and it's going to be the interest rate. So technically the short-term interest rate is very important in the short run. And what we're going to have is an IS curve that normally intersects at this potential GDP sort of zero steady state place. That's the way of thinking about it, where this is where the IS curve is normally. And one reason why we might be out here, this IS curve might have shifted out at this interest rate R bar, which is the thing that's shown right along here. So that's how this is going to fit into what we've seen so far. And now let me just pivot this around and show you that that's where we're headed, is focusing in on this graph now. What is the IS curve? Where does it come from? Why does it shift? And what we can do about it. Okay. Questions? Probably pretty confusing, and it should be because we haven't seen it yet. So that's where we're headed. Let me now step back and just show you how short-run output typically does fluctuate in this manner here. So here's short-run output. It's we're above the blue line, so this is some positive percentage. Here it's some negative percentage. And in history now, we see something that kind of looks like that. So this is Y tilde. Okay, it's not GDP. It's the percentage deviation in actual GDP from potential. And it's a story about being very, very far below our potential out here in about 2009 as a result of the Great Recession. So this is really quite staggering, quite impressive. I'm not sure that's the right word to use. It's sort of a positive connotation, but we're talking about 7 or 8% below our potential recently because of this enormous recession that hit. It turns out the very end of 2007 is the official starting date, but that was this point when things weren't so bad yet, and then they just really fell off a cliff. What else pops out here? Well, this recession in, I guess we would probably say 1982 and 83, where GDP fell about 4.5% or 5% below potential at the end of the recession. That's this shaded area, before bouncing back up to getting back, to near zero and then even into positive territory. That was another big crazy time, and one that we will be talking about in the course. Other than that, and especially prior to this most recent time, I mean, the wheels really came off here, right? In 2008, 2009, things went south, and boy, did they go south. Prior to that, things were a little bit better. This, at the time, was called, kind of the jobless recovery under George W. Bush, with a recession here in 2001, and then, kind of a slow resumption of growth and slightly above our potential, and at the end, perhaps. These were the Clinton years, where, there too, I guess, it wasn't really a period of sustained growth above potential. Here at the end, I suppose it was, and then a pretty big, fall from the peak down there. So what's happening here, the blue bars are the recession periods that are basically called by expert referees, if you believe they exist in economics. So it's a group at the National Bureau of Economic Research who look at the data and say when they think the recession began and ended. And what they have said is that, in fact, we are out of the recession. That's shown by the fact that this blue bar stops here. And yeah, there was a bit of an increase here. I think we would see a little bit more of an increase after that, but not by a whole lot. And so it's a bit debatable, I guess. I mean, looking here, but this was maybe a little clearer in '82 and '83, when there was a big resumption of growth back toward potential after this thing was called. Here, maybe not so much. Here also, maybe not so much in terms of GDP. Part of what's going on here is that they are looking not only at GDP, which is our only bellwether that we're using. They look at other indicators like employment, manufacturing, and other things like that. So there are a number of things they look at. Well, what kind of costs do these big swings represent? Well, this is one way of looking at it. A recession might be a 2-year swing that loses about 6% of GDP relative to potential. This is a little bit messy to look at. A back of the envelope thing could be on the order of this. If you're thinking about maybe a $12 trillion GDP, which is a little low, I think, actually, by modern standards, but was more correct in 2006 when I wrote the slide. It gets you to about, $2,000 or $3,000 of GDP lost per person. And that's a pretty big change. Now, it's also the case that during a boom, we benefit, but usually, the upside swings, except for this one, I guess, in the late 70s, the upside swings tend not to be quite as, concentrated. This time spent up here above zero is a little bit, we're not that far above zero, so it's not as though the gains are concentrated quite like this. The big, 6% swings are downward concentrated, and those are pretty costly. The other thing to note here is that this last bullet is a story about the average cost. And the thing is that in a recession, not everybody is hurt the same way. There are people who are hurt a whole lot who become unemployed. And there are people who are hurt not maybe much at all. Maybe they even benefit if inflation falls and they have kept their jobs, and they might even find that their real incomes are rising. So the costs of recessions are, on average, might look something like this, pretty significant. They're even higher if you think about how the costs are usually concentrated. Well, what else jumps around a lot? And not only does GDP fluctuate a lot, and we've also seen that unemployment fluctuates a whole lot, but also inflation fluctuates a whole lot. And so here's the story with inflation, where the level of this is low in the 1960s, in the 1970s, getting very high and volatile, and we saw this last time. And, as we discussed, I think the ups and downs tend to be tied to whether they're occurring in an expansion, the white periods, or in a recession, these light blue shaded areas. And so, in fact, this is no accident. We see that during expansions, inflation has risen, while during recessions, inflation typically has fallen. And so that's the basic story, that in recessions, typically, inflation falls. I think it's I think it's basically true. Each time we see one of these shaded blue lines, the thing is on the downward motion. It is sometimes said that in the 1970s there were, it was kind of an extended period of recession, but the way these cycle datings have worked is, the calls have been, well, the entire decade was not a recession. There was technically a boom here after, say, 1975, and that probably was part of the reason why inflation picked up so much. So based on this, there certainly is this temporal connection, the connection over time. Things are simultaneous, that inflation seems to be rising when output is above potential during a boom, and inflation tends to be falling when output is below potential. And so that's going to be our story, actually. And so this is the simplified textbook version of what is happening. And it's called the Phillips curve. Even though, you may have seen in Econ 101 a differently sloped, different looking version of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is a story about how inflation relates to unemployment or to output. But here our Phillips curve actually relates short-run output, which is the percentage change in GDP, or the percentage deviation in GDP. It's a story about, actually a change over time in output, or equivalently employment, to a change in inflation. So it's not a story about the level of output and the level of inflation, and sometimes you'll see the Phillips curve shown in that way, which I think is not a tiny bit totally confusing. It's really rather does one's head in, I think. It's a story about how the change in inflation can be related to the change in short-run output. And so let me just back up and try to cement this point in here. Back here, during this recession in 1982 to 3 or so, inflation was falling. So inflation is falling, that means the change in inflation is negative. And that's what we then see here. So in the Phillips curve, it's a story about in a recession, when short-run output is negative. So here's the other problem here, right? There's this zero that's in the middle of this graph rather than it's typically over on this side, right? So the zero is defined at this middle point. That when we're to the left of zero, that means short-run output is negative. We're in a recession, or the economy is slumping. And as a result, we've got to be on the Phillips curve, this blue line. As a result, inflation is falling, so delta pi, which is the change in the inflation rate, is also negative. So two problems with this graph, right? There's a zero here, and there's also a zero up here on the vertical axis that's in the middle of the game. Sorry? Yeah, so what is falling? Yes. It means inflation is falling, right? This is a hard graph to read because we're not accustomed to reading graphs that are in terms of changes, right? This thing on the vertical axis is the change in inflation. And when that is negative, it means that inflation is falling. When this is negative, that means that GDP is below potential, which is a little bit of a different story. It's not there too, yeah. It's like a level, really, more than a change. This is a tough graph, and this is why the second half of the course is also tough conceptually. The first half, I think, is harder, but the second half is also difficult. This is called the Phillips curve. It's an upward sloping line. If you have output above trend, meaning that the economy is booming, then you also have an increase in inflation. And it's one of the key elements in the short-run model, along with the assumption that policy can actually affect output. So why would this happen? Why would we see this kind of thing? Well, think about how output actually gets above trend. And the references here are totally dated. I don't honestly know what the big must-have gifts are, but a decade ago it was, for a Furby or Tickle Me Elmo, it was particularly high demand gifts that were 10 years old now. Nobody wants them anymore. But it helps think through it. So I don't even know what an equivalent thing would be. It's got to be something that everybody wants during the holiday season. This year it might be the Xbox One or the PS4, right? Those are both coming out, I think, this holiday season. And it's, it's a horrible time when you hear about people getting into fistfights in the, in like the parking lots at Best Buys, to try to get these things for their kids or themselves. So think about this like a big shock to demand. It's the holidays, everybody wants one of these things. And so what happens when you get your hands on an Xbox One? You got in line at the Best Buy at midnight or whatever, or well, probably more like 9 p.m. Then you stayed until midnight. It opened at midnight. You're the first one in. You buy your Xbox One, and then what do you do with it? You guys are economists, right? So what do you do with it? You play it? You sell it, right? You go and you sell it on eBay. That's what you do. How much do you sell it for? You sell it for a nice markup, right? That's what you do. One and a half times. Yeah. Another thing that you might do too. I mean, if you're a baseball fan, you use StubHub. If you can't make it to the game, you also might use StubHub to get a nice return on your investment in baseball tickets. I think it's illegal actually to scalp tickets in person at the stadium, but it's perfectly legal to scalp tickets when you're selling them on a secondary market like StubHub. Part of the reason it's legal to do that is because when you do that, I can't remember who gets a cut of it. It might be everybody involved, including the teams and also Major League Baseball, I think. They get a cut of it, yeah. So that's part of the reason why it's legal to do that. So that's why the Phillips curve looks like it does, is to think about that happening here. The other part of the story might be something about wages, that in order to produce these extra Elmos or Xboxes or whatever, they're in such high demand, the company might have to ramp up production. It's a little weird, of course, these days because a lot of the must-have goods are probably things that they're designed here in the United States perhaps, but they're actually produced in China. So it's not obvious that there would be a big increase in our local inflation through this channel, because the wages that are paid might be to Chinese workers in factories over there who are scrambling to put these things together, like whatever it is, the gold iPhone 5S, right? That thing sold out immediately, and I'm sure people made a lot of money in overtime wages in China producing these things. So that's how to think about this. Why it is, and here I'll show you the actual data, why it is that this Phillips curve looks the way it does. So before we jump into the specifics, because it is a cloud, but there is this upward sloping relationship. Notice that the zero is here, roughly in the middle, a little bit to the right of this horizontal axis. Short run output is the percentage we are in excess here. So up here we would be at 4% over our potential, 3%, and in fact 1973 was a very good year. That was when I was born, actually. We were 3% above potential. And you would expect that if that were true, being above potential means that there's a lot of demand for GDP. People really want to buy stuff. And why? Well, it could be they have extra income, they're exuberant, I don't know what it is exactly. Or the Xbox comes out and you've got to have one, you're going to punch your neighbor out to get it. And what you would find is that in a situation like that, there's really high demand for some reason, and as a result you would expect to see a big increase in the change in inflation, upward pressure on prices because everybody's doing this. They're buying stuff and they're using eBay and they're marking things up. And of course in the real world it gets complicated, so think about eBay where prices are pretty free, right? You have something that people want, you advertise it, the price will clear the market. It's a little bit more complicated, of course, if one were to actually think about the ways that producers of Xboxes or other high-demand goods actually market their products and price their products. It's kind of like how sports. Well, football, I would say, has very, very high prices. Does anybody have like season tickets to like the Jets or the Giants? The Jets, and so they charge a personal seat license. Is that And that was a new thing not too many years ago, right? So it's really expensive to. Yeah, for the new stadium, but you probably would agree the new stadium is probably a lot nicer than the old one, right? Oh, okay. You're not sure because you kind of like the old one because it sort of had sentimental value, maybe.
No, the new one is nothing special.
Nothing special.
It looks like it's still under construction. So
I don't know what the deal is with NFL. Maybe it's because there's no close substitutes for professional football, but they seem to be able to extract high prices from the fan base. The Yankees can, I think, to some extent, but if you look at the actual prices that are advertised for regular season games, provided they're available, which they aren't because people buy them immediately, the prices are actually not that high in the primary market. There are a lot more games. That's true. I mean, I guess that's got to be part of it. But I mean, well, I guess that's got to be it. Are there substitutes for the New York Yankees? Well, yeah. I guess the way to view it is that Tuesday's game is a great substitute for Monday's game, and whereas with the Jets, you have 8 games to choose from each year. Not a lot. With Xboxes and PlayStations, actually I saw this great article where somebody had taken the consumer price index, so they looked at inflation over the years and calculated the inflation-adjusted prices of the different consoles over the last 20 years or so. And it turned out that one of the highest-priced ones was, I think, the Sega Saturn, and you probably don't even know what Sega is anymore. Exactly, they don't exist anymore. I guess they do produce games, but they don't produce consoles anymore. And so the most pricey console was, the late 90s. It was late 90s by Sega. And I think everybody realized that they kind of really, they really biffed it on that one. They priced the console too high. So, there's a lot of, pun intended, I guess, gamesmanship in pricing of stuff, especially in the video game industry. That the market clearing price for an Xbox One is not the price that gets charged. The market clearing price is the price that you will see on eBay. Right? So Microsoft wants to set the price at some lower level to move the units very quickly. So I think all that is true, but for this, try to think of a perfectly free market, and eBay basically is one. It's, I'm sure our ifs, ands, or buts about that, but the basic story here is that when nobody wants, the Xboxes, we're in this kind of story down here where short-run output is negative, demand is insufficient to meet, what capital and labor can produce. In a situation like that, it actually exerts downward pressure on prices. And there too, I think people get a little bit hung up on, what happens if you are a merchant and there's less demand for your product. What should you do? Raise or lower the price? And let's just try to keep it really simple. You should lower your price to get people in the door. Try not to make that complicated by thinking about. But if it's true. If you lower the price and there's reduced quantity demanded, you also reduce your revenue. But you've got to do something to get people in the door, and that's our story. That this is a linear kind of sort of relationship. It's basically upward sloping. There are many points that are away from the line, and in particular, 1974 is a big one. Also 1981 and I guess 82. So this is just to say that this was a big outlier. A lot of inflation and in fact not a lot of extra growth. So that's kind of weird. And also some of these down here are a bit strange too. Like a big reduction in inflation, not a huge change in short-run output there. So as a result, what we're going to model is that this Phillips curve can shift around. We're going to imagine that it's not changing slope, but we're going to posit, and it's a reasonable assumption, that the thing can temporarily kind of jump. And in particular, this year, we're going to explain with a big upward shift in the Phillips curve to some higher level. What could change the Phillips curve, or what could shift it, I should say? What could shift the altitude of the Phillips curve? Well, it's something that has nothing to do with U.S. short-run output, but does affect inflation through prices. And in particular, there could be shocks to things that we import. I think that's the best way of thinking about it. And in particular, if the price of oil were to just absolutely skyrocket overnight, that could affect inflation more broadly. It has nothing to do with this X variable, our short-run output. It might eventually if prices rise and stuff happens and all that. But the first part of the story would just be that oil prices might rise a whole lot overnight, and nothing happens to our real economy, Y tilde, but we would represent that as an upward shift in the Phillips curve up, say, to this point. And that is the story, basically, for 1974, why things really were not good back then. Most recently, so does anybody live in New Jersey? Yeah, so, okay, a couple of you do. Do you remember the gas lines a year ago after Sandy?
Very short.
Very short. Ah, okay. So there were gas lines, and some of them I think were kind of bad in Jersey. I wasn't here, so I don't know firsthand, but some of the media accounts suggest that the gas lines were kind of bad in some places, but you're saying they were short, which is a good thing. But I mean, so why would you have gas lines at all? As economists, you might just say, well, why doesn't the price of gas just rise? Because if there are more people demanding it, right? Well, typically what happens when like a hurricane hits, or a disaster is that, authorities basically say, all right, let's not raise prices. And the problem with that is that if there's more demand for things like gas, and you might argue, well, people shouldn't be demanding more gas because in fact they're panicking. Okay, but they are, so what are you going to do? You're going to prevent them from getting the gas? And so this is a big thing back in the 1970s, that there were gas lines because the price of gas was rising a lot. People were kind of panicking, I guess. But another reason might be that the price at the pump didn't actually adjust to clear the market correctly. And so you would imagine if the supply of oil falls a whole bunch, the price should rise. We're moving along the demand curve. And maybe if it doesn't, it could result in gas shortages in lines where people are not able to purchase as much as they want at the price that actually is hanging around. So the next several chapters now introduce the IS curve. And the IS curve indicates or encapsulates this assumption that output in the short run depends negatively on the real interest rate. So if the real interest rate rises, then output in the short run is going to fall. That's the point about the negative dependency. We're also going to have a model in which monetary policy shows up. It's going to be the same model. I shouldn't have said it that way. The IS and MP curves are going to be together on the same axes. And the monetary policy curve is going to be almost laughably simple. It's going to be a horizontal curve, not really a curve, it's a line basically. It's a horizontal line at the interest rate target that the central bank sets. And we will talk a little bit about how that works in this class. And if you have taken money in banking, econ201, or plan to take it, in that course you might talk in greater detail about how it is that the central bank actually sets that technically it's a nominal interest rate, but how it sets that interest rate in the short run. And so the IS and MP curves together with the Phillips curve comprise the short run model. So that's the story. There's an IS curve and an MP curve. The MP curve is very laughably simple, I think you'll find. There's a little bit of an extra flourish to it to think about, under what circumstances the Fed can actually set the real interest rate and how that might be changed by certain things. But it's going to be simple. And then the Phillips curve, as we have seen. So the challenge is to think, well, the biggest challenge really is to develop the IS curve in your intuition. Why it looks the way it does and what shifts it around and what does it mean. So that's what we're going to start off with. So what is the relationship between interest rates and output and employment? And certainly interest rates are important. I just had the classic New York discussion of anybody past college age, and many of you even may have talked about this with your own friends, even at your tender young ages too, but once you're out of college, if you're around the New York area, the number one thing you talk about is housing, right? That's the number one thing. Maybe your commute is the number one thing. Maybe housing is the second thing you talk about. But it turned out that this guy, so I'm about 40 and he's about 40 and he has a wife who's about 40 and they've been working at a law firm in Manhattan for, I don't know, 10, 15 years or something like that. So they've made a fair amount of money, but they're certainly not wealthy by New York standards. And so they just bought a place in Brooklyn, and of course we were talking about that naturally. And he told me the interest rate that he got on his 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and it was something like 3.5%, which is a really good interest rate to get on a fixed rate mortgage. Just as an aside, actually, let me just say, in your future lives, you will think about this and be wary when it comes to purchasing a home and getting a mortgage from a bank. Be wary about the terms of the mortgage. This was a big problem in the lead up to the recession because a lot of people, I think, didn't look at the fine print and really got fooled and taken for a ride by the financial industry. A fixed rate mortgage sounds like a weird thing. It is a fixed rate, but what it really is a fixed payment by you mortgage. So it's a fixed amount of money that you will pay the bank every month from now until 30 years expire, and then at that point you don't owe the bank anymore. There's something that's really nice about that, right? There's complete certainty that the amount of money that you pay the bank every month is absolutely fixed. Now, if inflation is unexpectedly higher or lower, that could change the real cost to you of those payments. And other things equal, you would prefer, if you had a big stock of money, basically, you would prefer, no, it gets very complicated, right? I'm getting confused myself. But I think with a fixed payment schedule where you're paying the bank, you would prefer there to be more inflation, because then the real value of the payments is reduced. But of course, it requires you to also find that your wage is inflated, and it might not be, and that's one of the problems. So just getting back to the sort of personal finance advice, an adjustable rate mortgage is something in which your monthly payment to the bank is not necessarily fixed. It might get larger or smaller. It could get smaller, but it also might get larger, and that's dangerous. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about real estate in the future. And it's probably not something you're concerned with, and that it probably shouldn't be, because there are too many things to be concerned with, honestly. So people talk about interest rates all the time, and they do matter to us as individuals. I mean, this is the wild thing that I was working as a shoe salesman back in the early college years, I think. I was probably taking, econ201 at my college, and I remember I was working with in the shoe department with this other guy who was older than me. He was probably about 50 at the time, and I was about 20. And I remember he was getting really irritated at the Federal Reserve. It must have been for lowering interest rates at the time, because it was about 1992. He was really ticked off at the Federal Reserve for lowering interest rates, and I think it's because it meant that he earned less on his savings. But people talk about it because it affects them. Well, the Fed sets interest rates, and that's what he was ticked off about, and it's basically right. And why does it set interest rates the way they are? And why do we care? Well, why do you care? It's probably the micro things. It's taking out student loans, having to run more credit card debt, buying a house or car for which you'll need to borrow. And this is a very kind of young person perspective here, that when you're older, you probably have done all these things, and now what you want is an increase in the interest rate, because you've got money in the bank or in stocks or whatever it is, and stocks and interest rates don't necessarily move together. But the point is you have assets and you want a higher return on them, and that's also the interest rate. If you're young and you're borrowing, an increase in interest rates would be bad, and so that's basically the way to think about it in Econ 201. If interest rates rose, you might curtail these borrowing activities, and that's basically the reason why interest rates might affect output in the short run. It comes down to the insight that this is the macro economy, so there are many different types of people in our economy. Thinking about this particular type of person is very helpful in this regard. You could also think about businesses looking to conduct investment spending, which they typically do by taking out a bank loan. It does not help you to think about retirees and older people, and like the 50-year-old guy, the shoe salesman dude. That will not help you, because that'll lead you in the wrong direction. So the IS curve basically just shows that activity decreases when interest rates rise. And so right now I haven't shown you where the zeros are, but here's short run output, y tilde. Here's the interest rate, that's along the vertical axis. And the IS curve is just going to be this downward sloping line. So how do you make this intuitive? Well, I think if you want, you can view the IS curve as being a lot like a demand curve. I think that's okay. I think that will help you if you're trying to remember which way this darn thing slopes. It's a demand curve. We're basically talking about the demand for investment spending, or the demand for bank credit for investment spending, and the interest rate, the vertical thing. Well, what is typically on the vertical axis in these diagrams. If quantity is the horizontal, what's usually the vertical axis? It's price. And the interest rate is kind of the price of credit, or the price of borrowing to do investment. It's the price of investment. So viewing the IS curve as a demand curve, I think will help. If you're confused by why it looks the way it is, or you're trying to sort of commit it to memory, because you do need to know that it slopes downward for sure. You're not going to make it far in the second half of the course if you don't know that. Well, suppose the interest rate rises from R1 to R2, some level above it, then the IS curve is telling us that there's going to be a reduction in short-run output. And why? Well, home buyers, car buyers, all sorts of people who have to borrow to buy durable investment goods face higher costs, so they reduce their purchases. And as a result, short-term output falls from Y1 to Y2. This is going to be the most important element of short-run policy. Why is the Fed doing what it does? It's because of this. And notice that we've left out an entire segment of the economy, an entire segment of the population, basically, here. I mean, this is absolutely right. But on the flip side, just keep in mind that when the interest rate rises, there are people who like that. Right? So this is a story kind of about bad things, I guess, right? Homeowners are like, oh, this isn't good. People who want to buy cars, they're like, that isn't good. I'm not going to buy this new car. I'm going to make do with what I have or whatever. But keep in mind that there are people who are helped by this, and there are people like my parents and your grandparents, older people who may not be working anymore, who have savings in the bank, and they would prefer to see higher interest rates. So I think one of the big unspoken truths is that the thing about the short run is we're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, if I get the metaphor right here. There are different groups in the economy who will suffer and different groups who will benefit during this dance that happens when interest rates rise and fall. Why would you lower interest rates? It's to get homeowners and, well, home buyers, I should say, home buyers, car buyers, to do more of that, to buy more homes and more cars. But it hurts people who already have assets in the bank who would rather have higher interest rates. All right, well, we still have about 12 minutes remaining, so let me now show you how do we come up with this. Well, we could just specify it, and that's fine, but in econ201, we're going to go a little further than that. There's a reason why stuff does what it does. With demand curves in particular, they slope down because of diminishing marginal utility, or in the case of like a factored demand, like the marginal product of labor slopes down. It's because the marginal productivity of labor falls with more labor. And similarly, there's a reason why the IS curve slopes down, and we need to go into it to think about the things that really affect the economy in the short run. So let's begin now by reviewing the notation. So we've got current output we observe is uppercase Y. Long run trend or potential is Y bar, and that's going to be the growth model story basically, but it's not changing, we believe, quickly in the short run. Current output is potentially changing because of demand side conditions. And then short run output, Y tilde, is the percentage deviation of uppercase Y from Y bar. So we're going to basically use what we know about what this is. It's the expenditure side. C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. That's what this is. And we're going to move in the direction of finding out what this is in terms of Y bar and also the components of GDP. We're going to think about each of these components separately, and why? Well, each of them behaves a little differently over business cycles, so we want to treat them separately. So this is, again, national income accounting, where here I'm writing NX for exports minus imports, or net exports. And notice that this is actual GDP, which includes the fluctuations. And then I'm just going to write out the exports and imports. At this point, it doesn't really matter that much that I'm doing it, but it's the way the textbook steps through it and the way these slides do as well. And what we're going to do is make assumptions about how each of these things behave over time, and we're going to make them functions of potential income in particular. And you'll see why in a minute. Well, how do each of these components behave? Here on the next slide, I've got a time series plot of each of them. And there are at least two qualities to look at here. One is the degree to which these things wiggle. So these are all shares of GDP. So here consumption has started off the period maybe around 60% or so of GDP. Here's net exports, which have kind of always hovered around 0, meaning that we've, roughly speaking, imported about as much as we've exported. Here's government, the purple line. We started off around 24, maybe 23%. So there are two things to look at here, is the extent to which these things wiggle around, and also the trends are also interesting. So there have been trends in consumption as a share of GDP, slightly sliding upward. The slope looks like it's positive. And here, net exports, I would say, look like they've been trending downward, but with a little jump right here, and that's going to be important. The most volatile of these four is investment, and I admit it doesn't look like it's really volatile, but it's the green one here that really took a nosedive in the recession and is coming back up again. Government happens, it's a little bit, it fluctuates a little bit, not so much. Consumption does fluctuate, or it has, especially back here in the early 1980s, it was kind of dipping up and down. But really, of the four, what's the smoothest line? It's consumption, yeah. That was kind of the point of last class with personal finance and the long view, is that if you're doing it right, your consumption probably shouldn't wiggle around that much. And it turns out that we see that in the aggregate data, that it really doesn't wiggle nearly as much as investment and other things. And so that's going to be rather key. It isn't necessarily 100% true, but it's what we're going to start from. So over time, the expenditure shares have been stable with some drift, except basically for investment. And so as a result, we're going to model each of these components, except for investment, as just constant shares of GDP. So I cranked the numbers in the graph that I showed you. The average for consumption as a share of GDP has been about 64%. And so now I'm going to confuse you by introducing an algebraic reference for that, okay? So little ac is this share. And the thing is that it can change in the short run. It can also trend over the long run too, but that's going to be a little hard to think about in the short run model. But we want to use some algebra, to just represent that share. It's the consumption share. And so we're going to see a bunch of little a's, all of which have different subscripts. There's the consumption share. Little ac is 64%. Government has averaged about 20%. We're going to call that little ag, and that's 0.2. Exports have been 9%, so that's little aex is 0.09. There's an import share, and investment now is a little special. So it has averaged 18% of GDP since 1970, but it's also jumped around a whole bunch. So we're going to have a little AI, and that's equal to the average share of GDP that it typically is. But we're also, and you'll see this in a second, going to model a part of it as a fluctuation term that tends to do different funny things over time. Now, this is not easy to do in your head, but I'll just say this, that the A's sum to 100% of GDP. They have to. Everything we're talking about in GDP has to be either consumption, investment, government, or net exports. And so you don't have to know what these numbers are. I just felt like it is helpful to show them to you and now try to suggest that, here they are, that's what they are. But now we're going to move into a world in which we're just looking at these algebraic variables rather than the numbers themselves. But 0.64 plus 0.20 is 0.84, plus 0.09 is 0.93, minus 0.11 is 0.82, plus 0.18. So 0.82 plus 0.18 is 100%. So they all have to sum up to 1. just by definition, and that's going to come up in a second. So in the time, we've got about 5 minutes remaining. Now let me just motor ahead and show you what's going to happen. So again, as in many points in the class, what do? We start with what we know, and we work toward what we want to know. What we know is y is equal to c plus I plus g plus ex minus im. That's national income accounting. And what we're going to do is notice that each of these things is, by assumption, and it's a decent one, a fixed share of potential GDP. So that's the extra stretch here, is that we're gonna say, well, they're a fixed share of potential GDP, y bar, which is basically what I showed you, but not exactly the same. Okay, consumption is little ac share of potential GDP. So remember, this is 0.64. So consumption is 0.64 the level of potential. That's why this looks the way it does. Government is the government share, little ag, of potential. And then same for exports and same for imports. So all these things look exactly the same. They look confusing, but they're actually really very boring. They're just a statement that each of these components is a fixed share of potential GDP. Why? Well, it's actually in the data. That's what I just showed you, that empirical grounds suggest that consumption is actually smoother than actual output. Government is also smoother. It can go up and down a lot depending on what happens in Washington, though, honestly. And so it's more like how potential output is smoother over time. And then, like I said, you know, the smoothness of consumption is this point that, you know, people who have a life cycle approach ought to be thinking about smoothing consumption over time. So even if there are ups and downs in income, and there will be, you know, they're called recessions, even if there are ups and downs in income, that consumers who are fairly smart about this will smooth them over time. Now let me just introduce this last part, which is the worst part for sure. Investment, and that's, you know, what the hell does this mean? Excuse my French, but what is this? This is very difficult to read. It's just a statement that the investment share of potential is equal to a long-run average share. So A bar I, remember, was 0.18. It's 18%. So investment share of GDP is, on average, 18% minus whatever this is. So there's some coefficient, a positive coefficient, on the difference between the real interest rate, and this, it turns out, is going to be the long-run real interest rate. It's also the marginal product of capital. It means that if the real interest rate is temporarily high, if this is bigger than it usually is, then R minus the usual number is positive. And so B times a positive number is also positive, and the whole thing gets subtracted off. So if the real interest rate is temporarily high, then the investment share moves below 18% temporarily. That's all we're saying. So we start off with this same story that there's a long-run share, and that's the same as what we had seen, just multiplying through by y bar, you see that this comes out. It's the same format. And what's the other part? Well, it's telling us that if the real interest rate is above the marginal product of capital, then R minus R bar is positive, and investment drops lower as a share of potential than the long-run average, AI, which is 18% usually. Okay, so that's by assumption what we're structuring. And where we're headed now is using this to get to a place where we derive the IS curve, which is going to include this stuff. And we'll do that next time. Thank you. See you next Tuesday. Happy Halloween. Lights up, 1, 2, 3. Yes.
Are you doing the same thing you did with the midterm?